Pfizer Incorporated and BioNTech plc have offered to supply Africa with 50 million COVID-19 vaccines for health workers between hopefully February and the end of this year. Moderna Incorporated has no supplies for Africa though, while AstraZeneca Plc has no shots for the continent in 2021. It has directed the African Union to negotiate with the Serum Institute of India Limited, which is making the vaccine on behalf of AstraZeneca. The Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize and his team of experts yesterday presented the country's vaccine rollout strategy. Joining us now to talk about this is Professor Barry Schoub, Chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID vaccine. The National Health Department's Deputy Director General, Dr. Anban Pillay, will join us later on, but we're also joined by Chair of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, Professor Helen Rees, who also sits on quite a number of these committees involved in this. A very good evening to you both, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening.
Okay, so let me start with you, Professor Schoub. You obviously and your colleagues had a lengthy and substantive discussion with the nation about the availability of the vaccines, what we're looking at, and when you hopefully will get the first. So you're still fighting for as early as February for healthcare workers, I believe. But I want to get your response on the opinion that perhaps had we started negotiating earlier and strategically like the wealthier nations, that we could have been first in line. What is your response to that?
Thank you. My response is that at that stage, the vaccines were undergoing trials. We didn't know how effective, how safe they were. So the wealthy countries did put down a deposit for vaccines, really at risk, because at that stage the performance of the vaccine was not really known. And the majority of middle-income countries did not do that. They kind of felt, with their limited budgets, that they could not put money down for vaccines at risk. So what happened was that the high-income countries, the wealthy countries, took a lion's share of the vaccine production. They constitute about 13% of the world's population, and they, in fact, pre-bought about 51%. So a large amount of the vaccine had already been pre-committed to the high-income countries. And being a middle-income country, we, in fact, came on at a later stage. So, in a way, it's not that we were left behind. It was that we are now kind of coming on at a stage which may be a few months behind the others.
Professor Rees, what is your opinion? Your colleague, Professor Shabir Mahdi, has said that while noble in terms of the COVAX platform, it's likely to beat the lag that exists, especially when it comes to the legacy of inequality and the availability of the vaccines for low to middle income countries.
Yes, I mean, I've been very involved with the development of the COVAX facility, which is this global facility that WHO is one of the leading partners, together with a group called Gavi. And the idea was to stop and prevent what happened last time when we had the pandemic flu, when the majority of countries in Africa, including South Africa, really got no access to vaccines at all. And virtually all the vaccines that were developed were purchased by the developed world. By the time we got those vaccines, it was months and months later. So COVAX, the aim is to get equitable access for all countries, irrespective of your income, irrespective of your size. And it's so far attracted over 190 countries to sign up for it. 92 of those countries are the less well-resourced countries of the world, and they'll be supported by donor agencies and philanthropic agencies to purchase vaccines. But South Africa is a self-financing country, so we have to negotiate with that COVAX facility ourselves. And that did take some time. And I think it did show some weaknesses that I think the minister acknowledged yesterday, that we didn't really have a rapid financial tool that would have allowed us to press a quick button. And that's the kind of thing that is now being addressed.
Okay, we'll get Professor Schoub to answer that in just a moment, but let me stay with you, Professor Rees, on this. So as you mentioned, the countries that are already in line for that vaccine, I believe 29 are already getting vaccines. Now, please explain to me then the differences with a country like Kenya, which I believe is expecting to get vaccines by the end of January. How were they able to secure it so quickly?
Well, I'm not completely sure whether it's only through the COVAX facility or whether they've negotiated with other manufacturers.
Apparently, they haven't been specific about which vaccines particularly, yes.
Yeah. Exactly. So certainly through the COVAX facilities, countries that, as I mentioned, there are 92 countries that represent the least well-resourced countries globally. And so the negotiation for those 92 countries has been done en bloc. Countries still have to sign up for it in those 92, and not all of them who are eligible have signed up. But I suspect what's happened is that Kenya was probably a front runner in signing up for the COVAX facility through that purchasing block. And that purchasing block is going to probably get some of the first vaccines through that COVAX facility.
Professor Schoub, let's come back to you on that rapid financing facility. I mean, I saw just some of the reactions from the public on the suggestions that medical aid will have to come on board to the tune of something like 9 million, I believe. And I want you to please help us understand how is that going to put us in good stead, and is that going to be a further burden on medical aid users? Are they going to have to pay more?
No, I don't think that there's any idea to that the medical aid subscriber will be paying more. I think it's just a scheme to secure funding. So what's happened is that the government, the Minister of Health, together with the medical schemes industry, and then together with business, have formed a task team to secure funding to really kind of fund for the vaccines over and above the COVAX facility. The COVAX is really earmarked to supply about 10% of the population. So the idea of private funding is to get funding for two reasons. One of them to try and get earlier vaccine, earlier than what COVAX can supply, and also to get additional vaccine. So this was really a sort of a government-private initiative involving the medical schemes predominantly, because obviously they're a major player as well in the health field, and also big business as well to get the necessary funding.
And that's for 57% of the population, Professor Schoub. Are we able to monitorize that, and how quickly are you confident that that partnership will be able to raise the money quickly enough to meet that goal of ensuring that at least 67% of the population is inoculated to achieve herd immunity by the end of the year?
Yeah, the feedback that we've got from business to that task team is positive. That they would be able to secure that funding. I can't give you a time for two reasons. I don't know, for one. And I suppose it is something which is still work in progress. But the idea is that it would speed up the ability to purchase vaccine by getting that funding.
Professor Rees, we've spoken about the issue of cost and how prohibitive some of these vaccines are. I believe that Pfizer, for instance, is one of those that falls into that category. If we look at Johnson & Johnson, which South Africa is negotiating with, I believe we're planning to take about 300 million doses a year at a factory. Now, just explain that to us. How is it worked out? And if I know that it is government's responsibility for the vaccination, and the platform through which it will be rolled out has been put in place. But just explain to us the end user or the recipient, for instance, how all of those costs are going to be, worked out.
A very complicated question. So let me give it a shot. So through the COVAX facility, first off, the power of the COVAX facility, as I say, there's over 190 countries now participating, is that there is a negotiation that is globally coordinated. Now, clearly for the manufacturers, that's a big advantage. They have 190 countries of the world who are going to purchase some of their vaccines. So that gives them a guaranteed market. It also means that those the manufacturers will be able to differentiate their prices according to the wealth of the country through the COVAX facility. So it's not one price for every country. Poorer countries will pay less than middle income and higher income countries. So that's one way in which cost is going to be negotiated. The second way is through bilateral negotiations, and Dr. Pillay is not with us yet, but the government has been involved in bilateral negotiations, and I know that this is what the public public are very anxious to hear as well is how far are we and how quickly will that happen? So government has been involved talking to individual manufacturers, and there's a discussion about cost. Now, one of the things, and this has had global attention for a long time, is that very often these are quite secretive discussions about cost, and that a company will have a private discussion with one country and then another private discussion with another country, and they might end up with different prices negotiated. But clearly, one of the things that we're now hearing from quite a lot of the companies, and I think we really need to push this as a global good, is that many of the companies now who've got advanced development vaccines are saying, for the period of the pandemic at least, that they would look for very competitive pricing to ensure that there would be access for all countries. And that's the kind of language that we need to encourage and we need to push for.
And Professor Schoub, that would then drill down to local manufacturing, I'd imagine, if we as a country are to benefit. How would that work, including with what is set to be a national procurement model?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no vaccines which are manufactured in the country. There is well known that Aspen are importing or getting bulk coming into the country and then filling and distributing into the vials and to the pre-filled syringes. And then there's also the BioNTech facility in the Cape, which is also looking at doing a similar fill and distribution. So it would be clearly a great advantage if we could have manufacturing locally as well. And hopefully there will be in the not too distant future that ability to do that. But at the moment, we don't have manufacturing facilities.
I understand that, but the question really is, what are we doing as a country to facilitate that, to ensure that it is to our benefit, to ensure that we capacitate ourselves?
Yeah, I think there are ongoing negotiations, obviously private negotiations, between, for example, the BioNTech facility and various vaccine manufacturers for technological transfer. But beyond that, that information I think is really kind of confidential and is kept from the public. I don't know if Professor Rees might have any more information that I've got.
Professor Rees?
Well, there's two companies that have been talking about this kind of tech transfer for COVID vaccines specifically. One is Aspen and the other one is BioNTech. These are both South African companies, and they're both involved in aspects of vaccine manufacturing and production. But we're not doing the A to Z, as Professor Schoub just said. We're not doing the A to Z of manufacturing yet in the country. But certainly, this is an opportunity to really start to push for this. I mean, we are already seeing, if we look at what the African Union is saying, if we look at COVAX, and as Professor Schoub said at the beginning, we're already seeing this inequity in access to the vaccines. And so we really need to use this difficult pandemic as an opportunity to develop manufacturing into the future, and to say that really the African region does need much stronger manufacturing, and we do need tech transfer so that we can do, for example, what India has done, and that is build up our own competent and quality manufacturing facilities.
We do now have the Deputy Director General at the Department of Health, Dr. Anban Pillay, joining us. A very good evening to you, Dr. Pillay, and thank you so much for joining us, coming in at just the right time, because now we wanted to take our viewers through the various phases that you announced yesterday. So while we put up some of those graphics after we, get you to say hello to our viewers, tell us about the electronic vaccine database. How is it going to work, especially if you still have to figure out the choice of vaccines? You mentioned the candidates that you're looking for. Just take us through the selection process before we go through the various phases.
Good evening to you, and good evening to the viewers, and hi to Prof Rees and Professor Schoub. The vaccine system that's going to be used is leveraging off what we have as a current system for the registration. So we have an HPRS system which we'll be leveraging off. It's a health patient registration system, and it basically includes demographic information Added to that, we're going to add additional functionalities that allow us to capture information about the vaccine that's being used, the dose that's being used, and also an opportunity to include information about any adverse events that may be experienced by that patient.
How detailed will that demographic information be, Dr. Pillay? And I do apologize for interrupting you. And I say this because we spoke to one of the senior researchers at the CSIR. He was saying, obviously, age specificity would be good to know at this point. Yes. But some of the labor unions are saying we need to get a breakdown by race. We need to get a breakdown by economic strata so that we get a clear idea of how this disease has been spread and amongst whom and why.
Well, the vaccine system is about monitoring everybody who received a vaccine and also registering them on the system so that at any point in time in the future, you would know that Anban Pillay received his vaccine on this date, and when he's due for his second course, you can then manage that. The database of trying to manage the number of people that have been infected with COVID and their demographic information is currently collected by the pathology laboratories. So both the NHLS as well as the private labs have all of the information relating to those people that are tested positive for COVID. And then on the hospital side, those that are admitted and the conditions that they have and the severity is also covered within the DATCOV system. So that currently exists as we speak.
I'm curious, just going through the various phases, obviously in phase 1, 1.2 million healthcare workers are going to be targeted to receive the vaccine, but at phase 3, that's 16 million people. Is phase 1 enough of a sample to gauge the reaction and contraindications of the vaccines that some people may experience? Because you spoke about a portal of sorts that will be able to help you monitor.
Yes, I think it's important. I think Professor Schoub made this point at yesterday's meeting, that whichever vaccine we get, we would probably have the benefit of that vaccine being used in a number of countries, and we would have that insight into the reaction of the population to the particular vaccine, its effectiveness, any adverse event, etc. by the time it actually gets to South Africa in terms of being a mass rollout. Yes, but it's really important to vaccinate the healthcare workers, since they are the greatest risk at this current time.
And we'll get to the communication strategy in just a moment, because that too is important. But Professor Schoub, in your presentation, you mentioned that there are 289 COVID-19 vaccines in development, 66 in clinical trials. Have we whittled down the number of vaccines that may be a vaccine of choice for us, given the variables that would be suitable for our climate and our context, country context?
Yes, they have been whittled down to a much smaller number, and that's really the number that have been licensed overseas. So there are 3 vaccines which have been licensed overseas currently. Well, mainly 3. That's the Pfizer, Moderna, and the AstraZeneca. The Moderna is a vaccine which probably we will not be able to get because it's produced in limited amounts, and most of it has already been pre-bought. But that's not to say that we're not looking at other vaccines which have not yet been licensed. So there are probably about a handful of vaccines which we are looking at critically for various criteria. Before and obviously ultimately we need to be licensed by our local regulatory authority, which Professor Rees is the chairman of the board, can speak to it more than I can. But yes, it's a relatively small number from that. It's really a pyramid from that 289 all the way down to 50 odd who are in phase 3, down to the 4 or 5 which are licensed, plus 1 or 2 others which will be licensed shortly that we're looking at.
And Professor Rees, as chair of SAPRA, just take us through the regulatory issues that you would be looking at, especially if there's a need to expedite. Labeling and packaging, that's also very important for the greater public. A lot of them, we're asking them this question, would they take the vaccine, will it be available? Those are just some of the things that they are unsure about. And, you know, in layman's terms, does it make a difference if we really don't understand it?
Let me explain the process. So we have a national regulatory authority that's called SAPRA, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. What will happen, and is already happening, in fact, with at least 2 companies, and we're talking to others, is that the companies can start to submit their data as soon as they have it available. So they don't have to wait. Probably everyone's heard now we've got the phase 1, 2, and 3 of the clinical trial. They don't have to wait till they get to the end and they get the full results. They can start to submit data as it becomes available, and it can start to be reviewed. And so that's going to really accelerate the regulatory process. But in addition, we're also working closely with some of the large and very well-resourced regulatory authorities, such as the one in the US called the FDA, the Europeans, the UK. And so we have relationships with them that will allow us to share information. And we're also working with African regulatory authorities where we will be sharing reviews. But the bottom line is that for SAPRA, we have a dedicated team who are already working and looking at applications that we're receiving so that we can fast track these reviews out. Now, it might be that we then license the vaccine, or it might be that we give emergency approval. And you've probably heard that in places like the UK, the US, that emergency approvals have been given. And we have the capacity and the discretion to do both of those things. But the commitment is that the regulatory approvals will be done as rapidly as we can, but will absolutely ensure that we have safe, effective, and good quality vaccines made available with a lot of monitoring after introduction. That will be important because, as we've all seen, we've compressed the time for development of a vaccine from normally at least 5 years plus into 1 year. So we're going to have very rigorous monitoring, particularly of safety and effectiveness after introduction.
Dr. Pillay will get to answer this question in just a moment, but I just also want to reflect back on a conversation we had last year, Professor Rees, on targeted messaging for different demographics and the importance thereof. Are you part of the strategy? What should be the litmus test for effective communication, especially around vaccinations, to those various disparate population groups?
Yes, it's a very important point because we have been very worried in South Africa, but also globally, about vaccine hesitancy, that people are worried about, will this vaccine be safe? Will it be effective? Do I really need it because I'm young and perhaps I don't need it? And all of those reasons why people might refuse to take a vaccine. So we're going to have to think about each of the groups that are likely to be a priority. Healthcare workers, first of all. Many healthcare workers are working under extraordinary stress. I think the vast majority would welcome access as soon as possible to a vaccine so that they can feel protected and they can feel their families are protected, and also that they can continue working. This is incredibly important and has to be a very high priority. But the messaging for a healthcare worker who understands vaccines, understands why we're doing it, the importance of it, is going to be possibly very different to a 70-year-old who will perhaps in their living memory not recall ever having had a vaccine. So you're going to have to think, and who doesn't speak English, as you were saying earlier on, what do we say when we give a vaccine? Do we have to have special patient information leaflets that are translated into all of our languages? Do we have to have coaching memoranda for the healthcare workers so they can very simply explain to people what that's about? That's on the face-to-face. But before that, we will have to get messages out to these different populations that we really want to access and tell them why we are, we're prioritizing, say, an over 65-year-old age group first, and then other age groups after that. We need to explain not only to the people we want to give the vaccine to, but to other people about why they're not perhaps at the front of the queue. That communication strategy must be tailored and must be comprehensive and must address the whole population.
So, Dr. Pillay, what are you doing about that? And especially against the backdrop of the fact that we're seeing reports coming out of the US from people who have allegedly had very adverse effects from taking taking the vaccine. I know there's one of a nurse who has recorded herself saying, I forget what the nature of the disease is, saying that her face is not frozen, she can't move it. How do people separate fact from fiction? What is your communication strategy in relation to that, the safety and efficacy of these vaccines that people will be getting, and what to believe?
We will certainly be using multiple media strategies, through the social media, through TV, through pamphlets, as well as at the point where they're receiving the vaccine, providing with the necessary information. But it's important to bear in mind that the issues around adverse effects are linked largely to causality, and Professor Rees and the regulator spends a lot of time monitoring that and trying to establish, is this adverse event linked to the vaccine, or is it part of a normal course of disease that an individual may have, or linked to some other factors that are unrelated to the vaccine? Those are important questions to answer, and they are issues we must be very sensitive to and make sure we monitor very carefully, because the confidence around vaccines is usually lost if we fail to respond effectively to things like you just pointed out.
Professor Schoub, just back to the budget and financing of the various platforms and the rollout strategy. What is the task team going to be looking at?
Well, I think basically the first thing they have to really look at is what is the amount of money which is required. So they're going to be having to look at what percentage of individuals need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. They're going to look at the immediacy, who are the top priority, the second priority, the third priority, in terms of the timing of purchasing of the vaccines. They're going to have to looking at which vaccines, which will obviously information which will need to become from the health sector to them. So I think these are the parameters which they will be really kind of considering when they're securing the funding. So I think that in broad outline is what will be looked at in terms of trying to find the funding.
Professor Rees, lessons learned. I mean, last year it was said that supply chain obstacles led to Pfizer's cut to the COVID vaccine rollout target. What lessons can be learned?
Lessons learned so far. I mean, there will be national lessons that we're learning as we go along, and we know that there have been quite a lot of sort of concern about the speed with which we're getting vaccines. So I think lessons learned so far would be that communication to the public on everything that's going on behind the scenes is incredibly important, but also to listen to those concerns from the scientific community, from colleagues in the scientific community, and also from the general population. We haven't talked about civil society, but incredibly important groups who have a massively important role in when we start to roll out these vaccines to the various communities and the various groupings. Lessons learned so far in terms of some of these vaccines are that some of them have fallen beside the wayside, haven't continued, have not been successful. I think we're all delighted that we appear to have so many that are successful. But that we've got to keep lobbying extremely hard to get access to those vaccines for low middle income countries and for the African region, and that it's not a foregone conclusion that we are going to get these vaccines as we want them by the end of this year. I think the other sort of lesson that we're learning programmatically is the one that you just referred to. Something like the Pfizer vaccine that requires this very cold temperature for storage is probably not, well, not probably, it's not a feasible option for a country like South Africa, where we simply do not have those facilities and couldn't afford or wouldn't be able to put them in place rapidly enough to do it. We need to look at the vaccines that are practical in our setting, that are stable at temperatures that will be there, and that are going to be affordable to us. And those are going to be very important lessons that
Dr. Pillay, let me just end with you. If you could just briefly share with us if you have any concerns, as Professor Rees was saying, is also the technology behind the development of the vaccine. And that, of course, occurs while we're still in the midst of research and development. Do you foresee that being a hindrance to us getting the vaccines, especially if we have to choose the right one in time, say by February, end of February?
Well, I think the vaccines that have been developed thus far have been proven to be fairly safe. Even the new mRNA vaccines have been shown to be both safe and effective. So I don't really have any concerns around them. And you can see that thousands of people have already been vaccinated. We haven't seen any serious adverse events with them, and they appear to be quite effective from the clinical trials. I do think we need to monitor the clinical trials going forward as well for longer term studies to just understand what are the other effects of these vaccines, because we had very shortened trials in order for us to get the vaccines out and start providing the program.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. Professor Barry Schoub, who's chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID vaccines, Professor Helen Rees, chair of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, and Health Department's Deputy Director General, Dr. Anban Pillay. Thank you very much to you all.